I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. This is going to be a fabulous conversation. There's a context for it. And I happen to believe that everything we do is really lovely and interesting and compelling, but this stands to be one of the best that we've done. So that's my view and my hope and expectation and excitement. A quick word of thanks and then an introduction, and we're off and running. Thank you, Sid Lipset, Arts and Culture Editor, American Purpose, who has done so much to make today's program possible and more this week coming. We'll hear about that in a moment. Sonya Michel, wow, Professor Emeritus, University of Maryland, artist, and I would say intellectual entrepreneur and impresario of the first order. This started with your idea, and you have been driving it in terms of content and form and network throughout. Thank you. And then Adrienne Jameson, who is director of Washington in Stanford in Washington, who is a partner and colleague and friend, and who has organized and is hosting and is financing and dealing with about, I would say, 117 different issues, but maybe it's 134, all involved with this wonderful program and an exhibit that opens this Thursday, January 12th, at the Stanford in Washington Gallery. We'll hear more about all this, and I know that Michelle will put relevant links in chat for you. But that's my thanks, and that's my introduction. Carolyn, you are managing editor of American Purpose. You're a gifted writer. You're passionately interested in the issues and questions at hand, and it's yours to introduce the program, introduce our speakers, and moderate the conversation. Carolyn, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. So I'm so glad to see you all with us today. We're so thrilled to have you. So we have a really wonderful panel lineup for today. We have Sonya Michel and Oksana Kis joining us. Unfortunately, Elaine Showalter couldn't join us, but I think we're going to have an incredible conversation with our two colleagues. So essentially what we're doing today is this is kind of a scene setter, as Jeff mentioned, for this new exhibition that American Purpose and the Stanford in Washington are co-hosting. It's going to be an amazing exhibition that opens at the end of the week. It's curated by Monika Fabryanska. She's Ukrainian herself, and it's coming to us from New York. This exhibition has received incredible acclaim. It's been very popular, and it explores essentially the female experience of the Ukrainian war. So I believe about half the pieces in the exhibition, maybe a little more or less, go back to 2014. So we're looking at when the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then many of the pieces within the exhibition are also about the experience of being a woman in Ukraine just in the last year. And so what it's been like, and it is sadly relevant to today's discussion of kind of the female experience of war, war's impact on women, women's impact on war. And so we're so thrilled to have our speakers today. We're going to be kind of leaning into that and exploring that. And it's a great scene setter for what we're going to be doing later this week. So to start off, we have Sonya Michel. So she's the organizer of today's event. She's Professor Emerita of History, Women's Studies, and American Studies at the University of Maryland. And throughout her long and distinguished career, she's worked on a range of issues, including the history of women and the history of social welfare, how those two things go together. Throughout the last year, she's really focused quite a bit on social policy as it relates to caregiving. So whether we're talking elder care, child care, as well as kind of the positions and status of migrant caregivers. So I think very relevant to some of the roles that women play at wartime. It's going to be wonderful having her. Thank you, Sonya. And then we're also joined by Oksana Kis. And Oksana is a feminist historian. She's an anthropologist. And she leads the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Ukraine's National Academy of Science in Lviv. So she's currently teaching in New York. So fortunately, she's in the same time zone as many of us right at the moment. So we're so thrilled to have her, to have you both speaking today. So pretty much the plan for what we're going to be doing is we're going to have we're going to have Sonya and Oksana speak for, 10 minutes, give or take, to make sure we're covering the topics in the way we'd like to. Then we're going to open the floor for about 20 minutes of Q&A. And as we get ready to get started, I would just ask that you all take a look at the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Make sure that wonderful mute button is clicked for now. And then we can unmute and have a conversation a little bit later on. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sonya.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Carolyn, and thank you, Jeff, for your generous comments. Just quickly to fill in, part of the way this got started was that I saw the exhibit that Carolyn referred to, Women at War, in New York at the Friedman Gallery last spring. And when I went to visit it, the director of the gallery, Friedman, was there. And I said to him, this exhibit has got to be seen in DC. And he said, if you can find a venue for it, we'll do it. So I came home and I said to my husband, Jeffrey Herf, who can we contact? And he said, how about American Purpose? And that's how we got to Jeff Gedman and Sydney and Carolyn. And they in turn contacted Adrienne Jameson at Stanford in Washington, and the rest, as they say, is history. So we are here. But one of the reasons that I was particularly interested in this exhibit was because, as Carolyn suggested, I've worked on a number of different topics related to this. And one of my very first books was an edited collection called Behind the Lines, Gender in the Two World Wars. And this was published in 1987. So people had, and at that time, historians, and especially women's historians, had just begun to challenge the idea that war was, as they said in Gone with the Wind, men's business. They were beginning to see that it was very much women's business as well. It wasn't just a matter of power and control over territory and military strategy. It was about all of the broader context in which wars occur and the ways in which women become involved in that. And one of the ways we began to think about it was that war was very much a gendering event. That is, it threw into relief the ways in which women are expected to be peaceful and peaceable and keepers of the hearth, and men are expected to go out and be aggressive and even violent in their defense of that hearth. And they began to realize that in fact, those stereotypes didn't always hold true. And in fact, especially in recent wars, those stereotypes and those notions have become blurred. Before I go any further, let me just quickly say, for people who aren't familiar with gender studies, I'm not talking about physiological and biological differences between the sexes. I'm talking about social and cultural constructions of identities and roles that have to do with the differences between women and men. So that's what I'm using it as kind of jargon, but that's what I'm talking about. So one of the, as I said, but when when I worked on this book Behind the Lines in 1987, the field of women in war or gender in war was already beginning to be pretty well developed. And there were a number of studies that we were able to draw on in collecting essays for this book and putting them together. And since then, the research has continued considerably, especially among historians of the West. Women's and gender historians of the West were concerned mainly with the wars in which the West has been involved, although a number of other scholars in other fields in other parts of the world are also beginning to look at that. And in the course of this research, we've developed a number of concepts that pertain especially to, in my case, to World Wars I and II. And one of the things that I'm interested in particularly is hearing from Oksana the extent to which those analytical concepts hold up, and the extent to which we need to begin to rethink them and change them in order to understand what's going on today in Russia and in Ukraine. One of our initial findings was that the traditional assumptions about women and men, that women were peaceable and men were the ones who were aggressive and violent, did not necessarily hold up. Women's participation in the two world wars revealed that they were not willing to just remain as keepers of the hearth, waiting passively to be defended, but they were eager to become active participants in the war effort. They in whatever ways they could. So they served as nurses, ambulance drivers, They joined the war industries and so forth. And their fierce patriotism earned them new rights. Suffrage in the United States, Great Britain, Germany, Sweden, the Soviet Union, and many East European countries right after World War I, and in France and Italy after World War II. But some of the other advances they made, that is, opportunities to work in men's jobs, which were, of course, higher paying, and or even to work outside the home at all, having access to public services such as childcare, those things really lasted for the duration only, as they said. And in fact, they were always presented as that so that women wouldn't get too used to working outside the home or having childcare. And in most countries, those things changed right after the war. And women went back to what they had been doing before, mainly being at home, and then resumed their places in industry and other positions of leadership. But another way in which the stereotypes didn't necessarily hold up was with regard to men. And as Elaine Showalter, who unfortunately can't be with us, has shown in one of the essays in this early collection of mine, writings of authors such as Britain's Siegfried Sassoon revealed that men had gender anxieties. That is, many of them were not so eager to join the military and to risk their lives in defense of the home front. And these anxieties were undoubtedly experienced by many men, but very few of them were willing to express them. Sassoon was really an exception in this regard. So as a result, the stereotypes kind of remained in place about peaceable women and aggressive men. And in the post-war period, as women and men resumed their previous roles with some modifications, the power differentiation between men and women remained. One set of authors, Margaret and Patrice Higonnet, have referred to this as a double helix. That is, while men move forward during wartime, because they are, in fact, moving into military positions, and women move outside the home. But there's still a difference between them. And then after the war, everybody goes back down again. So the power difference remains. And although the larger gender context did change after each war, especially as women gained new rights, the power differential between the sexes persisted. Another concept that probably needs to be challenged is one referred to in the title of that 1987 book, Behind the Lines, which suggested that the terrain of war was always clearly demarcated between the home front and the battlefront. Of course, the dramatic changes in military technology over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries have increasingly blurred that differentiation, that demarcation. And today's military, as I'm sure Oksana is going to talk about, really allows no sanctuary. There's no place where women and families can be safe. As women go about their tasks of maintaining everyday life, in addition to whatever other roles they've taken on, they're always at risk. And we've certainly seen plenty of that in the news about Ukraine. So that's a very great difference between today's wars and the wars of the past. Finally, let me say something about changes in the definitions of masculinity as they're playing out today. As I've noted before, traditional gender definitions associating women with peace and men with aggression and violence meant that men, in order to earn recognition as war heroes, men had to demonstrate extraordinary physical strength and courage, and women were supposed to remain in the background. And to a great extent, the two world wars perpetuated those definitions. Given the workings of the double helix, women's movement into industry and even into certain branches of the military didn't really threaten male primacy. But in this post-feminist era, things are different. In many societies, women have gained political as well as economic equality with men. And more importantly, owing to this work of scholars in women's studies and women's history, male and female roles and definitions have been exposed as the cultural constructions that they are. So a question that arises is can gender egalitarian societies win wars, or must they reestablish traditional masculinity in order to prevail? Vladimir Putin seems to believe the latter. As the historian Alexei Tikhomarov has shown, Putin has created a kind of hyper-masculinity in today's Russia. a sociocultural scheme in which he presents himself as this is Timorov's words, a fearless and courageous generalissimo, a collector of Russian lands. And he urges, and indeed orders, his soldiers to disregard the laws of war and use the most ruthless tactics that seem to be designed to restore the old gender order with men in a very dominant position. As Tikhonov puts it, looting, pillaging, torturing, beating, murdering, and sexual violence against women, children, and men constitute an arsenal of practices that serves as a ticket to the club of supporters of Putin's masculinity. So that's the end of a quote from Tikhonov. Not surprisingly, under such a gender regime, the men who flee Russia in order to avoid conscription are portrayed as not as principled objectors to the war, but as effeminate powers. Indeed, for Putin, democracy altogether is portrayed as effeminate, especially when it entails gender equality. I asked Professor Tikhonov whether he thought that the men who have left Russia, and there are something like 1 million of men have left, whether they accept this characterization. And this is what he wrote to me, quote, "Some of them accept the state's attribution of weakness to them and experience depression and emotional burnout in the conditions of forced migration. But the key motive of the more financially well-off and most educated is that they are not willing to die for the illusory goals of the president and want to lead an ordinary, peaceful life. As a rule, these are successful professionals and fathers who express masculinity by flexibly combining traditional paternalistic patterns of behavior, primarily as the head of the family, and modern practices of consumption, travel, free time activities. What is clear is that the central role of new media and communications technologies, such as WhatsApp, Signal, Skype, and so forth, in providing an emotional support function and making family space despite distance and the trauma of physical separation. Practices of resilience and the construction of productive masculinity in the role of the father include talking to their children every day, telling them stories before they go to bed, discussing the everyday life of the children with their wives, and so forth. Such practices of masculinity not only normalize men's self-perception and mitigate the isolation of migration, but also lead to an exchange and mutually reinforcing gender roles. From this perspective, the war and forced migration offer a chance of reassembling masculinity in Russia and beyond. It's incredibly heartening to hear this optimistic view of what's going on, but I was very grateful to Professor Tikhonov for sharing that with me. So again, while it's clear that the war in Ukraine is yet another gendering event, it's one that challenges the kinds of concepts and analytical approaches that we historians have used in the past. We need to come up with new ways of thinking about war. Perhaps some of the insights we had about previous wars will help us understand this one. But as Professor Kis, I think, is sure to tell us, we need some new ways of thinking about it. So I'm happy to yield the floor to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sonya, for giving me the chance to speak. Initially, I planned to talk about two spheres of women's activity, of women's responses to the current war, Russian aggression against Ukraine. But I'm afraid for the sake of time, I will focus just on one of them. I'm going to share my screen with you, and there will be a number of images and some explanations, so we have a clearer, a better understanding of my rather short talk today. So, Ukrainian women's experiences of this war vary greatly from most victimized women on the Russian-occupied territories. They facing all kinds of violence, just trying to survive, and losing their loved ones and their homes and their family members, and up to the female members of the Ukrainian government and parliament who engage in orchestrating the defense efforts on national and international level. So I will focus on the women serving in the military to discuss what we got as the Ukrainian historical legacy and how the Maidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, and the Russian war on Ukraine contributed to further normalization of militant femininity in the public discourse. Doesn't move, yeah? Oh, okay, sorry. Here we go. The number of women in the Ukrainian army was growing rapidly over the 80 years of the Russian war on Ukraine, and this process accelerated after the full Russian invasion in February 2022, when a huge number of women who voluntarily enlisted to the army, to the military forces, and to territorial defense unit to defend our country as soldiers. One must not forget, however, that after Ukrainian law, military service is a duty to men and a right for women in Ukraine. Today, women constitute about 15 to 17% in the military forces, which is one of the highest levels in the world, according to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense. This comes with no surprise if you take into account that Ukrainians have a century-long history of women's military service. During the First World War, a women's squad was created within the Ukrainian Secure Rifleman Legion, the Ukrainian volunteer military division in the Austro-Hungarian army. Scholars managed to identify and to reconstruct the biographies of 34 names of those service women. Olena Stepaniuk, then she was 23 years old, became its commander and the first ever female petty officer in 1915s, and she was awarded with a medal for bravery second degree in 1914s for her military valor in the legendary Battle of Makivka Mountain. Thousands of Ukrainian women fought in the ranks of the Red Army. Some of them became the icons of military craftsmanship and valor, decorated with the highest safety. Their stories were widely publicized by the Soviet media, of course, that changed public perception of service women, and those legendary female soldiers served as role models for generations of Soviet women, including Ukraine. Women also participated on a large scale in the Ukrainian nationalist underground, both in the Ukrainian Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists as a political movement and in the Ukrainian Insurgent Army as a military structure. And always all memories of those experiences were suppressed for decades. Their stories and legacy became a subject of thorough research and widely covered by media over the last 20 years. The events of Maidan and the mass protest all over Ukraine galvanized the entire Ukrainian society and catalyzed the process of awakening of women's active citizenship too. Women were present on Maidan in great numbers since the very beginning of the mass protests in Kiev, and they made up to the half of the protesters in late 2013, but the number this year dropped to 15% on site as the confrontation obtained more violent character in February 2014. One must be aware, however, that despite absolute prevalence of women in Maidan kitchens and infirmaries, women performed a number of other important roles in the protest. They were medical doctors and nurses, journalists, hotline operators, translators, drivers, investigators, lawyers, political experts. They made munitions, prepared Molotov and collected drugs to be thrown in riot police, and also they built barricades. Women contributed to the revolution of dignity in a variety of ways, although not necessarily being physically present on barricades. A number of feminist initiatives on the Maidan contributed to the women's awareness raising as full-fledged citizens entitled to decide how to serve their country and to determine the nation's future. Women's squads that began to form on Maidan later became the source for women volunteering to the army after the Russian military invasion in Ukraine in spring 2014. Women's squad activities and leaders that are widely covered by media, contributing to the promotion of the militarized image of femininity in public discourse. The story of Nadia Savchenko, no matter how controversial this character turned to be later on, contributed significantly to growing popularity of the image of a woman warrior among the younger women for whom she served as a highly admired role model. Being actually a victim, a prisoner of war, a hostage of Russian aggression, he actually behaved as a real hero with courage and dignity facing the enemy's brutality. Savchenko's case also served to further normalizing of military as a professional occupation for women, as the number of women's applications to military academies skyrocketed in 2014 and 2015. The research project and subsequent advocacy campaign under eloquent name Invisible Battalion, as the number of women taking part in the anti-terrorist operation 2015 reached like 1,000. Even multi-faced gendered discrimination against women in the military. It ultimately resulted in the decree to remove the major restrictions for military service for women, especially in combat roles, and introduce special anti-discrimination policies in the army. Various images featuring militant femininity flooded the social media back in 2014. They found their ways to market or appeared on merchandise and to the streets for the billboards. Remarkably, those images usually combine rather feminine features or appearance, like long hair and slim body, and military attributes, guns and uniforms, with clear markers of Ukrainian as a traditional dress, as a symbol of use, blue and yellow colors of the national flag, and the trident as a national emblem, suggesting that being a warrior is an extension of normative femininity, a traditional one, just another faculty of Ukrainian woman to be activated now. This trend only strengthened in spring 2020. After 8 years of women's military service, Ukrainian society found itself well prepared to accept as soldiers on foot with men. The flood of images featuring armed women ready to fight in social media testified to the normalized or rather positive reception of women as warriors in the public discourse. Again, there are clear markers of the Ukrainian identity like dress, national embroidered garment and flag, combined with traditional feminine features like use, long hair or braid, and slim body. What differs from the popular glamorous portrayals of women typical to all kinds of advertisements, these women are not playful or flirtatious. They seem very serious, sometimes angry, and resolute in their new roles. Obviously, these female images symbolically represent the Ukrainian nation, as the nation is usually collectively imagined as a female figure. This time, however, it appears not as a powerless, frightened mother, sister, or wife calling men to defend her, but as a strong and self-confident, mature woman prepared to fight back with arms in hand. Remarkably, many of those images make clear reference to history, either to legendary Princess Olga from Kievan Rus from 10th century, who set her enemies on fire by means of words carrying flame, and here she sent out Bayraktar, those air weapon pilotless drones, or a poster featuring Olena Stepaniu mentioned before, as Rosie Riverter, along with a quote from iconic Ukrainian poet and feminist Lesia Ukrainian. Women's historical legacy helps to legitimize women's claims for active citizenship in form of military service. These images send clear message of women's strength and aptitude to be part of the struggle. Other images make clear references to the Ukrainian folk tradition, specifically popular beliefs and practices of witchcraft as a part of women's culture. Women are portrayed as able to manage supernatural powers, to be witch aggressors, They represent all kinds of overwhelming forces aimed against the enemies. The poetry by Людмила Борова буде тобі враже так, як відьма скаже, о, enemy will get all, or which curses, which imitates traditional folk non-Christian prayer or course or a magic formula, obtained extreme popularity and numerous music videos became viral in social media. These references, traditions of women's informal power, encourage women to search for sources of strength and forms of agency. They serve as yet another legitimization for women's claims for fighting the big web. And in conclusion, Ukrainian women have strong and vivid historical legacy of military service in the 20th century. Women's experiences on Maidan woke up women's awareness of active citizenship, and women claimed their right to equal participation in defense of the Ukrainian democratic choice and sovereignty. The Russian war in 2014 caused women's voluntary military mobilization and accelerated the process of public reconsideration of women's role in the army and in the national project at large. The revision of normative femininity evolved to incorporate the role of a woman to become its integral part. The full-scale military invasion and the total war of Russia against Ukraine catalyzed further normalization of militant femininity in the public discourse. This legitimization included references to the Ukrainian historical legacy of women's military service, as well as traditions of folk culture. And examples of women's agency and power from the past serve to justify women's claims for empowerment and empowerment. Remarkably, the women's military service is not perceived as opposing or undermining traditional normative femininity. It appears rather as something inherent to it, its forgotten element to be reclaimed, recognized, and practiced today. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Oksana. That was really wonderful. And I think it's so fascinating how, we have Sonya talking about almost this idea of, at least, looking at a lot of US and World War II history as far as gender assumptions go. We have all these ideas of traditional gender assumptions, but then when you look at the actual role of women in war, it kind of is completely the opposite of those cultural constructions. And then I think what's so interesting, Oksana, is what you were just saying, builds off of that in a sense. But I know also you frame it in that context of what the Ukrainian women are doing is they're actually recapturing, they're kind of re-energizing some very traditional forms of, you might say, femininity. So I think, so at this point, I would love to open the floor to questions. What I would ask folks to do is raise their hands. If you have Zoom open right now on a personal computer, if you just kind of look at the bottom of your screen, there's that horizontal band. There's a little option that says reactions. Click on that. There's a little hand icon. So what we will do is when we see those hand icons pop up, we will call on you and then you can unmute yourself as people collect their thoughts and figure out how to find that little hand option. Sonya, can I ask you to give a quick reaction to Oksana's presentation?
Yeah, no, I was really very, very interested to see this long tradition of women in the military. But the one thing I might say, when she referred to the images being the militarization of femininity, I was also thinking it's kind of the feminization of the military. I mean, here are all these women, dressed wearing military uniforms, but they're also obviously very feminine. So I wonder one question I would have is, how do men in the Ukrainian military these days, how do they react to having women? Are they fighting together? Are they fighting in separate units? Whatever. And a related question is whether, has there been I don't know enough about this, but has there been an independent women's movement in the Ukraine? And if so, how has that fed into this move of so many women into the military? So those are two questions I have.
Do you want me to answer now?
That'd be great. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. those are actually several very complex questions. Thank you for them. When it comes to to how military and the army as an institution accepts women today, it's a long story. So it took women quite a long time and lots of efforts, including the feminist initiatives and women's rights advocates campaigns to make sure that the military women's rights in the army are ensured properly. As I mentioned, that research and advocacy campaign, Invisible Battalion, which ultimately led to removal of some basic restrictions for women's military service, which caused actually women's gender-based discrimination, as women were hired for the so-called civilian positions in the army, while they actually participated in the combat, but they were not recognized as combatants, and therefore the female veterans were not entitled or were considered ineligible for all kinds of social benefits for the veterans. So that was unfair. And there are also there and still are all kinds of stereotypes and also many cases of sexual harassment in the Ukrainian military. And of course, since this institution is so masculine institution and so conservative one, and many men are really protecting their terrain against women and not really willing to have women among the soldiers for different reasons, with all kinds of prejudices. And, it's not that easy for many women to establish themselves in these specific units, but many depends on the commander attitudes. So it's a long way. It's unfinished story. It's not yet a 100% success story. But what I really want to stress here, and I tried to make the point during my talk, that the media are doing really great job covering the stories of service women in a very, very good way, showing them as professional soldiers and officers first and foremost. Of course, there are all kinds of excesses, like discussing their appearance and the cosmetics and stuff like that. But it gets Ukrainian society used and accustomed to perceive women in this specific profession as something normal and natural. So I would say, and there are also those initiatives like Women's Veterans Movement, which also provide like legal counseling for service women who might be exposed to sexual harassment or any kinds of abuse in the army, so they could take the cases and help women to reestablish their rights and so on and so forth. So it's a long story, it's a complicated story, and there are scholars who are like doing their specific research on that subject. When it comes to the women's movement and feminist movement in Ukraine, I am very proud of it right now. So it's very vocal, it's very visible, it's very, let me say, becoming more and more influential. And Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity, greatly contributed to the very dramatic change in Ukrainian society. And a huge number of young and professional women, independent, like autonomous women, well aware of their rights and well aware of gender-based discrimination and all kinds of injustice, joined the movement and established new organizations, which are very active in Ukraine since 2014. So I would say this is a special phenomenon for Ukraine, rediscovering, reinventing the feminist movement for itself, as we all are aware that in Soviet times it was not the case.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for that, Oksana. So we have two folks raising their hands. We're going to start with John Edelman, and then after that, once we get Oksana's response from that, we'll move on to Alexander Lukashuk. So, John, if you'd like to take the floor.
Hello, everybody. This is an extremely interesting conversation. I have a question in regards to the structure of how the military works in Ukraine. So, like here in the United States, we used to have a draft for men at a certain age. Women weren't included in the draft, and then we turned to an all-volunteer army. How is the structure there? Has it changed since, obviously for men since 2014? But is there a structure for women to be drafted or do some military service like they do in Israel? That's part of their, they must serve a certain amount of time. And secondarily, is there like a reserve officer training corps? Is there a training corps that women are included in as well to move children to adults in the military system? So that's my question.
Oh, thank you. Actually, in Ukraine, as I tried to say, military service is a duty for men. So during the martial law, since the full-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine, men of military age are conscripted just to the army with no regard to their wish or only because of their health condition or the professional occupation, they could be waived of military service. But women are not obliged, so they are not conscripted. They could volunteer, and all those women who serve in the army, all of them are volunteers who had specific military training. I mean, not of them are just volunteers, like civilian women who joined the army for the time of war. Many of them are professional military service women, like trained professionally in military academies. They are like officers and have specific professions in the military. But the other women, the civilian women, could join the army as volunteers and to get the professional training in the military profession or as paramedics or other professions which are in need for the army. So yes, women are not in military duty in Ukraine, even for the wartime. So that's the case as far as I know. And there is another part of that story that women could leave the country and become refugees. And all those millions of Ukrainian refugees who went to Europe, to North America, to other countries, 90% of them are women and children. And the other 10% are elderly men, those above 65 years old. Because the younger men are forbidden to leave the country. They cannot cross the Ukrainian border as they are considered to be potentially being the resource for the army.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Alexander, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, thank you so much. Fascinating. I wonder if Oksana or somebody else can comment on the bizarre case when a wife of a Russian soldier was urging him to rape Ukrainian women. How does Russian women are viewed? How are Russian women are viewed from the Ukrainian side? Are they enemies? Are they participants in this war? Are they neutral? Can you comment on that case, please?
I would say that Ukrainian women would consider those Russian women encouraging their men to commit all kinds of crimes against Ukrainians, and especially the sexual violence against Ukrainian women. They are considered to be the accomplices, of those crimes, those who actually stir up the hostility, who actually contribute, albeit indirectly, to those crimes which we all can observe in Ukraine today. So I would say that the popular belief among the common Ukrainians is that there are no good Russians today. All of them are in one way or another in compliance with all those crimes, with this genocidal war against Ukrainians.
Thank you so much for that, Oksana. Do we have anyone else that has a question at this point? In the meantime, I'll ask, I see we have a question with Victoria Wilson. Please go ahead and go for it.
Hello, thanks so much for this presentation. So most of the world underestimated the Ukrainian people's ability to be successful in this last year. And so I'm curious if this capacity of the women to support and fight during the war, what sort of contribution that made in your mind to this success. And then if there's one particular surprise that you even saw as far as a positive outcome from this cultural heritage of women being involved in military.
Thank you. That's a very important question indeed. I would say that when it comes to this surprise, this miracle of Ukrainian resistance, successful resistance to the military aggression, for me, it comes with no surprise, as Ukrainians were trained for centuries to resist Russian Empire and its colonizing policies. So we are well trained for generations, in our resilience and in our strength to be able to survive. So the other point is that what surprised me really was the scale, the mass scale of common people participation in humanitarian volunteer initiatives. I had no time to elaborate on that topic today, but when we have a closer look, we can see that unlike in previous times, like a century ago, Ukrainians and Ukrainian women also had a big experience of charity and helping the prisoners of war, the refugees, all kinds of people who suffered the most from the war. But those initiatives were like organized and managed by women's organizations and educated women, the women from intellectual elites. What differs today that the majority of volunteer initiatives come from a very rank and file Ukrainian women, oftentimes with no special training or education or even any experience in public activism, in community activism, even women at the countryside who self-organized to make these volunteer kitchens and to produce like huge amount of food for the soldiers, for the refugees, for internally displaced persons, to manage the shelters when the huge number of people started to come to central and western Ukraine when the war began. They were like fleeing from the east. So that was absolutely unprecedented for me, both in terms of the large scale and because of this grassroots nature, and also in terms of this collective effort, which I believe, I'm pretty sure, this experience of working together, this solidarity, this networking will have a huge effect on women's active citizenship after the war ends with our Ukrainian victims.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Oksana. So we are starting to approach the wrap up of our event today. So what I'm going to ask for these final questions, if we could have Marina ask her question, followed by Irene asking her question. I think we'll then just try to get a quick response from our speakers. And then should we hand it over to you, Jeff, to wrap it up?
Sure.
I saw your hand raised, so I didn't want to.
I have a question, but we're going to run out of time and I want to hear the other colleagues. So back to you and the home stretch. Thank you, Carolyn.
Great. All right. Thanks, Marina, and then Irene.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask about the role of Olena Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine. We've seen her in a very important diplomatic position in Washington. Is she as active in Ukraine towards the women
in Ukraine, and was she as active before, or has her role changed during the war?
Great, thank you. And then could we actually have Irene ask her question real quick, and then we'll just do a wrap-up response.
Yes, thank you very much. This war has basically highlighted a lot of the cultural differences between Ukrainians and Russians. I think that awareness of those differences has been significantly raised. And I wonder if Oksana could comment on the differences in feminism and the history of women's organization and feminist development in Ukraine versus Russia.
Okay, I'll do my best, to cover both questions as quick as I can. So, and the quick response about Olena Zelenska's role in women's organized movement before the war, not before the war, but before the full-scale aggression, since President Zelensky was elected. She participated several times in the annual Ukrainian Women's Congress, the top level for women's event in Ukraine. Both times she had a speech and she was discussing, and she actually is doing a lot in terms of supporting women's business activities and the violence, like counteracting the violence against women, like family-based violence. So she is aware, and she is trying to watch the situation with women's rights in Ukraine. And I believe she's doing something within her capacity as a first lady, not probably today specifically for women, but she's doing a lot for Ukraine, as you already mentioned it. In terms of the second question about the differences of women's and feminist movement in post-Soviet Ukraine and post-Soviet Russia, I would say the major difference is there are many, but the major difference is that Ukrainian women's organizations, initiatives were in close collaboration with the Ukrainian state for the entire period, although with different, level of success. And the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian political authorities were listening to women's voices, and they also tried somehow to collaborate with special attention and pressure from international agencies and institutions and organizations. So all those actors, women's organizations, the state, and the international institutions managed to work together towards, elimination of gender-based violence, gender-based discrimination in Ukraine in different spheres. And it led to the substantial changes in legislation and on the level of policies and institutions and so on and so forth. What happened in Russia, I believe, that there was a huge gap between the women's movement and the Russian state, which was not prepared to pay any attention to women's issues, to gender-based discrimination. So women's groups worked with the international donors, while the Russian state, never listened to women's groups and never paid attention, never responded to international agencies' pressure. So the women's groups found themselves kind of in a very weak position, isolated from the state support and with no proper, support or effective, pressure from the international agencies. So I would say that the Russian women's groups actually failed to achieve any substantial progress exactly because the state actually didn't take women's issues seriously.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Oksana, for exploring these really important questions. And thank you, Sonya, so much for making this possible, for having us all here. You said, okay, Sonya, you'd like to comment? You're on mute.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a quick comment. I mean, I think what Oksana has just been saying really confirms what I was also saying that wars are events about gender and gendering. And this is really, I mean, of course, there are many political issues going on here and power grab and land grab and all that, but it's also a war about gender styles. I mean, you can't imagine a greater contrast between leaders than between Zelensky and Putin. I mean, Zelensky is so understated and Putin is vaunting his so-called masculinity all over the place. And, you know, what Oksana just said about the relationship between the women's movement and the state couldn't be more different in the UK, in Russia and in Ukraine. So, you know, it's another chapter in gender and war, this war. Unfortunately, Ukrainians have to live through it, but they're doing an incredible job. And I would just learn so much from Oksana. It was wonderful to be able to be with you on the same panel. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sonya. And to echo that, I think we all just learned so much. This is so valuable. Please make sure to go visit the exhibition once it opens up at the end of the week. Woman at War is at Stanford in Washington. That's their Stanford's campus, Washington campus location. It's up near Woodley Park in DC. On our website, we're going to have some details about it in the near future. And just once again, thank you all so much for joining, for our speakers, and for making this possible. So we look forward to seeing you all again in the near future.